All right, and thank you for joining us today for our World Literature Book Group, which meets every second and fourth Wednesdays of each month, both on site at Mechanics Institute in downtown San Francisco and online via Zoom. I'm Nico Chen, and I am the program manager here at Mechanics Institute. Today, we are starting a little earlier because we are joined by a special guest, the wonderful Simon Lesser, who is the translator of Faraway the Southern Sky by Joseph Andras. Simon, do you want to quickly introduce yourself to the group?
Yes. So my name is Simon. I am a translator from French, and I also am in the French department at NYU, where I'm currently finishing a doctorate, so writing a dissertation on late 19th and early 20th century literature.
Oh, cool.
Thank you so much, Simon. And for our introductory conversation with Simon today, I will begin with a prepared list of questions. And at around 5:45 p.m., we'll open it up to the Q&A with the group. You can either add your questions into our chat box as your questions emerge, or you can also use the raise hand function in your Zoom, and I'll call on you if you want to ask that question yourself. And Simon, I was supposed to read your bio, but you've actually told us quite a few things, but this might be competitive. Oh, I'm sorry, repetitive. Simon Lesser is a PhD candidate in the Department of French Literature, Thought, and Culture at New York University, where he works on questions of voice and musicality in late 19th and early 20th century literature. We've gathered here today to talk about his translation of Joseph Andras's Faraway the Southern Sky, published by Verso. So my first question for Simon is, Simon, we started with your professional bio, but we would also love to learn more about your linguistic autobiography. So in other words, how might people understand who you are through the lens of language?
Sure. I suppose the easiest way to go about that is to say that my first language.
Oh, mute. Oh no. So there we go.
Can you hear me now? Is this better?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, good. So as I was saying, my first language is actually French. And I am indeed French for all intents and purposes, but English is a close second language. So I was raised by journalists. I'm the child of journalists who at some point had to move around for work. And so from the age of 9 onwards, basically I lived in Anglophone countries. And clearly the kind of relationship between the two languages, French and English, which is the two literatures I work on and do research on, and obviously the passage from one to the next via translation, all of these things have stayed with me and are kind of the integral part of my professional life.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Simon. And let's talk a little bit about Faraway the Southern Sky and Joseph Andras. What drew you to this work or this author?
So a bit about Joseph Andras. I don't know how much you've discussed him or are about to discuss him in general, but he is a very interesting contemporary French writer. I think the first thing perhaps to note about him is that he writes under a pseudonym. So Joseph Andras is not a real name. He doesn't want anyone to know what his real name is. His first novel, which I also translated, I think the English title, as I remember, is Tomorrow They Won't Dare to Murder Us. It's a novel about the Algerian War. It was published in France in 2015, where it won him at least one very prestigious prize, the Prix Goncourt for debut novels, which he refused, both because he did not want his identity to be revealed, but also for political reasons. I believe one of the main reasons he refused it in his statement was that he didn't want competition to be a part of literature in any way. And you think it's wrong for authors and books to be made to compete in that way. So he's a very interesting writer, I find, for these reasons, and in fact for the reason for the fact that he blends kind of a very strong interest, and in fact is animated by radical left-wing politics. But unlike perhaps the cliche of those writers that are, radical, and especially on the left, he has an avowed poetic bent and an interest also in language for the sake of language. And so the kind of juxtaposition between the two, a devotion to political subject, while also an interest in in poetic language, or in language for its own sake, a lyrical attention to language. I think that the combination of the two makes him a very, very interesting writer, and a kind of unique writer, both within the French context and via translation. I think certainly within the American context.
And would you mind just reading a little bit from the book itself, a passage to give us an idea of the author's voice in your translation?
Sure. I remember you told me how long, I shouldn't be very long about this. So maybe I'll just read a page or two, something like that.
Yeah, 2 to 3 minutes would be, like a
Okay,
page or two.
okay.
Yes.
So
Okay.
2 pages at the most. Okay, okay.
Mhm.
I mean, just also, I know, well, actually, I don't know. I would imagine you've all had to read it, or parts of it, or perhaps not yet, but maybe I should introduce it. I mean, this is very quickly, so Faraway the Southern Sky, in French, Au loin, le ciel du Sud. And it's about Ho Chi Minh before he was Ho Chi Minh. So his formative years immediately after the First World War, which he spent in Paris. And I'll read the opening 2 pages, which are, I think, quite a grandiose opening. And my editor had some problems with them, but I like it very much. Maybe we'll hear what you have to think about. There is no life but in the shadows. In backlight and in the features we struggle to discern, in the silhouettes doubtful of their shapes, and in the subdued, if not subjugated, glimmer. The words half said in the haze, the galleries delved into, and the embers sheltered in our hand. Great men failed at all, you think, bartering their souls for the limelight. Glory and renown's 11 letters spell the same defeat. So much blood under the pedestals of their statues, such surrender on the radiant screens, so many emissions in the exalted scenes. Nothing quite appraised like success, once warned a communard dear to your heart. Ho Chi Minh, the icon, the revered supreme leader, interests you very little. Portraits printed on banknotes from Vietnam won over by international trade, even less. You only ever cherish those at the back, the losers, the ignored, the third rates, the fuck ups. Those there laid low under shoddy stars, not worth even a penny. We know the president, illustrious goatee enthroned in history somewhere between Lenin and Gandhi. Indeed, that's probably all we know. The high priest of a communism perished and everywhere denounced. But the man for whom you harbor such affection was still a moneyless vagabond. He wasn't called Ho Chi Minh for one thing. He changed names like he changed shirts, sweating in the hope, no less, of making us all equal at last. He slept in pigsties, wrote articles in a language his mother had never sung to him in, and roamed Paris under the eyes of devious cops. It's this man in exile in the nooks of a capital just out of the war that you go in search of, knowing you won't find a thing.
Thank you so much for sharing that passage with us. That was beautifully read. Yeah, I see some nods and some, happy faces after that beautiful reading, Simon. Thank you. And for those of us who may not be familiar with the art of translation, can you tell us a little bit more about the translation process? How did you encounter this work? What was its road to publication?
Well, that's quite straightforward. So I translated his first novel, and then I just had a conversation with my editor at Verso Books about what to do next. It was between this book and another one. My editor thought this one sounded more, he doesn't read French, but he thought that the idea of this one sounded more interesting. And so we went with this one. The translation process. I mean, the translation is kind of it's a game like creative writing, but just with more constraints, more rules. Because you do have to reproduce and stay as close as possible, or reproduce a version of another work in another language. And so it always involves a couple of drafts. The way I start is, one has to start close as possible to the original language, basically do as literal a translation as you can, always paying attention very closely. It's almost a very close reading of the original work, and making sure you have all the particular arrangement of the words, the choices that the author makes on the page. and then through three, four, sometimes five other drafts, you slowly get the original language out of your mind, and start editing English prose like it's English prose first and foremost, because you absolutely do not want the book to read like it is a translation, basically.
I'm going to now open it up to a Q&A. I don't see any questions in the chat box, but does anybody want to step in and ask a question? Libby, go ahead.
I'll ask the question. This language in this book is but kind of challenging, I think. And I was wondering, do you read the book many times before you even begin to translate it? And do you do any background homework on like Ho Chi Minh and on on the book before you start?
So some translators steadfastly refuse to read the book they're translating before they translate, because they want to ensure that the language they're reproducing and the effect they're going for is as close as possible to the effect they had when they read it the first time. Obviously, if you read a book many times, you kind of can get lost in the weeds, or you lose just the idea of what it's like reading it for the first time. I'm not so fussy, so I did read it beforehand, and in fact, as part of the conversation I had with the editor, it was, based on that experience and reading, that book and another one by Andras. And as for research, there's all sorts of things that have to be researched. In whether it's about Ho Chi Minh's life, so I had to verify. There's some moments, as you can say, the language is extremely precise, but it's lyrical, and it's in French especially, something that is very difficult to do in English, is it mixes slang with very refined and very higher brow kind of vocabulary. And some slang, for example, is very dated. So it would have been words that would have been common in the 1920s in Paris. And so there's a kind of research around vocabulary for that, to make sure that the words that then I had to find, it was come to be somewhat equivalent to those in French, were from that era. And then, yes, the Ho Chi Minh's life had to. I mean, there's whether it's there's a moment in there where I think there's a poem by Pasolini which I had to look up in the original Italian because I couldn't find, there was no translation of it in English, and I didn't know exactly where he got it from. There's moments in Ho Chi Minh's life I wasn't sure exactly at some point what Andras was trying to say, so I had to look up exactly. I think it was when he was imprisoned in China, or something like that. Was it after he went back to Vietnam, or before, and it was the English, imprisoned him before, or something like that. I remember having to having to look up properly in a biography. So yes, there's always research involved, basically.
Okay. I have a question. I have actually two questions. The first one is, do you find that the people that you do these translations for actually go out behind you and try to find somebody who speaks the same language and then reads what you've done and says, good, bad, indifferent? Okay, that's the first question. Second question is, what's the French equivalent of fuck up?
The first question is easy. So the Verso actually hires a copy editor that speaks French. So the kind of read through for grammar and checks particular turns of phrases to see that seem a bit weird, and it's like, did the author actually do that? There's someone that goes over it, at least one person that goes over it and speaks French. As for the French equivalent to fuck up, I have the French right here.
Okay.
It is les foireux.
Could you spell it for me? I don't think I can do that.
Yes, Foireux. Foirer is French slang. It's a verb, and it means if someone is a foireux, they messed up their lives. They're fucked up, or they're down and out, basically.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I'm glad we don't have to quite censor this, but we're gonna go Scott, Marcia, and then Caroline. Okay. All right, Scott, your question, please.
Well, my question is, have you met Joseph Andras? And I don't know physically, but at least, on phone or by some way of communication, were you able to discuss your translation with him, have a dialogue about it? Was he able to read it in English, or does he not speak English? So just, more or less that dance or that dialogue. Did you have that with him?
So I've only ever corresponded with Andras via email. He has a personal email that people can get in touch with which people can get in touch with him. And yeah, I've discussed. I mean, his English. I know he's talked to to my editor, and I don't know if he uses essentially internet translation to no, but he can sort of correspond in English. But I always make sure to send him a draft of the translation before there's even conversations with the editor. So when I send the first draft to the publisher, I always send it to him as well. But he never has. I mean, besides, say, conversations about the title of the first novel, for example, which had to be, which the editor wanted changed, and Andras was, and I didn't particularly want it, but Andras was like, okay, if they want to change it, then it has to be taken from the same poem that I took my title from. So stuff like that. But usually he's very, very hands-off.
Thank you, Simon. Marcia, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, I have a final question. Who's the lady
Marcia's on mute.
on the right shoulder? Over your right shoulder. Who's the lady over your right shoulder?
That's actually the person I share an office with someone here. But that is, by the look of it, a Russian lady. But I couldn't tell you more.
Okay, thank you.
Marcia, do you want to go
Marcia,
ahead?
you're on mute.
Marcia, yeah.
Okay, there I am. How long does it generally take to like finish a translation, and do you often not have enough time to get it finished in terms of when the publisher would like to get it finished?
I mean, I always send in a draft when it's due. Those questions are difficult to understand. I mean, if I was difficult to respond to because I've never had the luxury of just working on the translation. So, I've translated while also teaching or writing, academic articles or doing research and something else. But this one, yeah, I mean, doing all of that, it's a very small book. It's in English, it ended up being 30,000 words or something. It's still with all the drafts, and then with the the editor coming in and asking for everything. The process was a year and a half, something like that.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
But I know translators who mostly just devote themselves to translation, and a book like that they could do. I think I could do as well in 3-4 months.
Okay, thanks. Interesting.
Yeah, I also have two questions. First one, it's just a stunning translation. It's really beautiful. I really felt like it was kind of I kind of felt like it was in
I can hear it.
a dream, like moving into the past, and I was an invisible kind of being floating around in those streets at that time, trying to get the experience of being there. The question was, is that sort of dreamlike or lyrical, poetic, is that what he uses in other books, or is that a voice for this book?
So there's always that aspect to it, but it's more or less. So he has a book that is much more almost a journalist book, not quite. His second book was about the French island possession in the Pacific called New Caledonia, and about a revolutionary militant who was killed there in the early 1990s, and that's much more kind of straightforward in the way he goes about it, but in the way it's written, it's much more like I'm on the ground looking for what happened, in the late 80s on this island. But there's some of his other novels. I mean, I really want to make sure that this one is the next book of his that's translated. He wrote a book also that came out in 2022 about Camille Desmoulins, who was an important figure during the French Revolution. And it's also, for example, very lyrical. And I think also the first novel, the one that's already, it's also been translated, is also more lyrical, though also much more violent. But yes, he is clearly an interest of his.
What was the name of the book from 2022?
Pour vous combattre. It hasn't been translated yet.
would-
It would be to fight you
To Fight.
or to fight. Yeah.
The second real quick question is you probably haven't seen it, but a friend sent it to me, an article on translation in the current New Yorker. I think it's by David Searles about.
No, so it's about demons. Actually, a friend of mine wrote it by Max Norman, who's a good critic,
Okay.
a good journalist.
So I was really interested in that idea of phenomenology in translation. Can you comment on that?
So I haven't read Damien Searles' book, so I can't quite comment on it. But it is basically, I mean, there's another critic called Clive Scott, who's also published a book last year, and it seems to be, a way critics, or at least academic critics, are going about trying to understand the process of translation. And through phenomenologies of reading. So it is not so much trying to understand the act of reading as a kind of deciphering interpretation of the text as a moment that's not in time, but really what happens when you read a book, when one has to interact with the language in front of them. And that, I suspect, although again I haven't read Searles' book, that might be interesting as a means of talking about translation. Because it allows one to write about translation as a first and foremost an act of reading. It is basically one's interpretation of the text in front of them in the moment that it then tries to be reproduced, rather than a kind of than just going for meaning and like delving deeper and deeper into potentialities of the meaning underneath the word, etc., etc. It's about the text as it exists in the moment one is reading them, when he's reading it.
The question was, does that work for
Does
you?
that work for you?
Oh,
Is that-
I didn't hear. Sorry.
No,
Does that
I
work
was-
for me? As in,
Yeah.
do I think that's quite?
Valid.
I think there's a bit too much that's done with phenomenology, and both in general to write about reading, but also for translation. Translation. There is, I mean, what I like about translation is also what I suspect people have problems with is that you can't win. There's no actual way you can really reproduce the text in front of you, and some people are really disappointed by that. Essentially the full kind of context of the choices of the sentences, of the kind of the sheer history and tradition behind, especially a writer as interesting and as lyrical as Andras, behind every little decision and every turn of phrase, is not something that one can reproduce exactly in English. One can give equivalents. And so some people try to rescue translation as a kind of art of potentiality, as in one can read a text in however many ways, and I'm introducing, as these whatever few ways in my translation. So the art is about, again, the reader that's reading it, that's reading the work, and allowing for all these potential interpretation, these moments, this rapport with the text. But I think really it's about making choices and being fair to the original text and to the reader, and also while ensuring that the text you write is interesting and good. It's a bit more. I have a more simplistic, perhaps, idea of it than the phenomenologist, at least.
Works.
And I do want to honor Simon's time, so we have time for 2 more questions. First, we'll start with Keith, and then we'll have 1 more. Go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, now that you've translated 2 of his books, do you have a suspicion as to who he is? And is that a question that even interests you?
I remember, well, actually, I think I know his name, his real name. And one thing I suppose I can reveal is that there are moments, there are weeks on end when Joseph cannot be reached, and he travels a lot around the world. I translated a small text by him a few years ago, in which he writes about the few weeks he spent in Mexico, in Chiapas, in southern Mexico, with the Zapatista brigades there, and was observing kind of what was going on there. I know he spent a lot of time in Turkey, in particular in Eastern Turkey, in Kurdistan. And he is, he has connections with, certainly with, it seems, political activists in very many countries around the world, and he writes about them. I think he'd be, if anything, actually, he would want me to mention a book that still hasn't been translated yet, which he wrote 2 years ago about a Kurdish musician who's has been imprisoned for many years in a Turkish prison called Nudem Durak, and he's been trying to get her out and trying to get and wrote a book about it, but she's still unfortunately in prison there. So that's what I can say. I think I know certainly the kind of the kind of man he is, what he does. I'm sure I'm more as convinced that he used to be an activist in France, perhaps in his younger days, say 15, 20 years ago. But otherwise, you know, besides that, I couldn't tell you more.
And we will have Carol ask the last question.
And you answered my question. I was going to ask about the dedication to Nudem Durak, who that person was. And now you said free one day. She's in prison in Turkey.
Yeah, she's a musician. He's visited her family, in fact, a few years ago, and has gone back there a few times. Wrote a book again that hasn't been translated. We're trying to get a publisher in the US interested in it. And yeah, she's the figure of the let's say an unfortunate victim and a kind of a symbol of the Turkish repression on the Kurdish population.
And I'm going to jump in with just one more question. Do you want to tell us about any recent or upcoming projects that you are excited about?
My own project specifically. Well, there's a lot of academic thing, which I don't think. That said, if you're interested in translation, I wrote an essay in which actually, so Max Norman, who wrote that piece in the New Yorker about Damon Searles, was my editor. And it's for a magazine called The Drift, and it's about, I heard someone mention Proust earlier. It's about the Proust translations. There's new translations of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time being published every few years, and they keep coming. And it's an essay both about translation in general and about the relative merits of these translations. So if you're interested in reading Proust, or you are reading Proust, and you want to know how the hell he came into English and what that means for him, then do check it out.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day once again, Simon. This is one of the best holiday gifts to this book that you can possibly bestow upon us. So once again, thank you for being here. And we are now going to be transitioning into our informal discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I hope you have a nice, I hope this book at least allows you a nice conversation, a nice discussion.
And thank you for zooming all the way in from New York City. And in case you're ever in San Francisco, just shoot me an email and we're more than happy to give you a personal tour of Mechanics Institute, okay?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Nick.